True disturbing smart home glitch stories. It's 2:14 in the morning and your baby monitor turns itself toward the crib. Not the camera panning on its own. Cameras do that, it's a feature, fine. I'm talking about the physical device sitting on the dresser, rotating 15 degrees to the left. No app open. No voice command. No one home except you and your 6-month-old daughter, asleep finally after 2 hours of crying that you couldn't explain. You pick up your phone. The app shows the feed live. The room is dark, lit only by the night light shaped like a moon. And for just a second, half a second, really barely enough time for your brain to process it before your thumb instinctively locks the screen, you see the crib. And there's someone leaning over it. Now here's the thing. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because that's not a ghost story. That's not a campfire tale your uncle tells to scare the cousins. That's a real 911 call. That's a real police report filed in Texas in 2019. That's a real family who moved out of their house 11 days later and never went back for their furniture. If you've got a smart speaker in your bedroom right now, if you've got a camera pointed at your kid's crib, or a lock on your front door that you control from an app, or lights that turn on automatically, I need you to keep watching. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't about hackers. It's not about Wi-Fi glitches. It's about something a lot of very smart, very rational people had to learn the hard way. Sometimes the thing controlling your house isn't a bug. It's not even a person. Sometimes it's something that was already there. My name is Nick, and I spend way too much time thinking about smart homes that started acting on their own, or on behalf of something that was already connected to them. If a video like this helps you sleep with one more light on tonight, do me a favor and hit subscribe and drop a like, because trust me, by the end of this one, you're going to want to be part of a community that gets it. Because normal people don't get it. Normal people think this stuff is just Alexa acting weird. I used to think that too. Let's get into it. Okay, so the story I want to tell you tonight isn't the baby monitor one. That's real, that happened, we might come back to it in a future video. Tonight I want to tell you about a man named Daniel Ostrander and a house on a quiet cul-de-sac outside Asheville, North Carolina, that he bought in the spring of 2021 for what he thought was an unbelievable price. And look, here's the thing about unbelievable prices. There's always a reason. Always. I don't care if the realtor tells you it's just market conditions, or the sellers are motivated. In my experience, and in about a dozen stories just like this one that I've collected over the last 2 years, when a house sells for 40% under market value in a good neighborhood with good schools, the universe is trying to tell you something, and the universe does not care if you're listening. Daniel was 34. Software engineer, worked remote, the kind of guy who genuinely loved technology, not in a nerdy, obsessive way, just in a this stuff makes my life easier way. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't the type to believe in anything he couldn't put a multimeter on. And that matters, because it means what happened to him didn't happen to some anxious, jumpy guy who was primed to see ghosts in his toaster. It happened to a skeptic. A guy who, 6 months earlier, would have laughed at this exact video. He moved into the house with his girlfriend, Priya, and within the first 2 weeks he did what any tech guy does with a new house. He smarted it up. Locks, thermostat, a full speaker system wired into every room, a video doorbell, motion-triggered lights in the hallway and stairwell. All top-tier stuff, all connected through one central hub sitting in the living room, humming quietly on a shelf like some kind of digital watchdog. For the first month, nothing. Genuinely nothing. That's actually one of the details that always gets me about these stories. There's this honeymoon period. The house is quiet. The system works exactly like it's supposed to. You start to trust it. You start to let your guard down. Now you might be thinking, okay Nick, Every horror story has a calm before the storm. That's just how storytelling works. And sure, that's fair. But here's what most people don't realize. In the case files I've gone through, and I mean actual complaint records filed with smart home manufacturers, actual testimony from families who went through this, that quiet period isn't just narrative convenience. Investigators who study this pattern call it the observation window. The idea being whatever's doing this, and we're going to get into what whatever means, it watches first. It learns the rhythm of the house before it starts interrupting it. Chilling thought, right? Sit with that. It started with the porch light. Small thing. Priya noticed it before Daniel did. She came home from a late shift at the hospital, and the porch light, which was set to turn off automatically at 11 p.m., was on. It was 1 a.m. Not a huge deal. She figured the automation glitched, walked in, went to bed. 2 nights later, same thing. Except this time the light didn't just stay on, it was strobing. On, off, at a rhythm that was too fast to be a loose connection and too consistent to be a software bug. Daniel actually filmed it on his phone because at that point he thought it was funny. He posted it in a smart home forum, joking that his house was trying to communicate in Morse code. A guy in the comments, and Daniel didn't think much of this at the time, but he'd remember it later, replied with one sentence. Have you checked if it actually is Morse code? Daniel didn't. Not then. Because 2 days after that, the lock started. Now here's where I want to pause and address something because I know some of you are already thinking it. You're thinking, Nick, smart locks glitch all the time, my own front door locked itself twice last month, this is just bad engineering. And normally, I'd agree with you. Normally, this would just be a story about a company that needs to fix their firmware. But here's what made this different, and this is the detail that made Daniel actually sit down and start writing things in a notebook instead of laughing them off. The locks weren't malfunctioning randomly. They were locking and unlocking in a pattern that corresponded, every single time, to the exact moment someone in the house said a specific phrase out loud. The phrase was, I don't like this house. Priya said it first, half joking, standing in the kitchen after the third porch light incident. The front door, 30 feet away in a completely different room, audibly clicked shut and locked. She laughed it off. People do that. That's a very human thing to do, actually. When your brain is presented with something it can't process, the first move is almost always denial dressed up as humor. Ha, weird, right? It's a defense mechanism. I get it. I'd probably do the same thing. But then it happened again. And again. Daniel eventually tested it on purpose. Stood in 3 different rooms, said the exact phrase, and every single time within about 2 seconds the lock engaged. He tried other phrases. Nothing. He tried saying it in a different tone, whispering it, saying it in Spanish since Priya spoke both languages fluently. Only the exact English phrase spoken out loud triggered it. Every time. Now, a smart lock doesn't have a microphone that listens for arbitrary sentences and reacts to their meaning. That's not how the technology works. There's no voice assistant integration on that specific model that would even be capable of parsing semantic content like that and turning it into an action. Daniel knew this. He'd built systems like this professionally. And that's the part that scared him more than the lock itself. Not that something impossible was happening, but that he, an expert, could not explain it using any framework he had access to. Here's what most people don't realize about cases like this, and I've said this before but it bears repeating. The technology is never actually the threat. The technology is just the medium. It's the same reason old stories had ghosts rap on walls, or move a rocking chair, or flicker a candle. Whatever this is, and by this, I mean the actual documented pattern behind dozens of cases like Daniel's, it doesn't create the phenomenon. It uses whatever's available. In 1920, it was a candle flame. In 2021, it's a smart lock with a firmware exploit nobody can find because there isn't one to find. I want to be really clear here because I take this seriously and I think you should too. I am not telling you demons are real or that your Google Home is haunted, so go throw it in the trash. What I am telling you is that there is a well-documented pattern, reported independently by unconnected families in different states, with different smart home brands, none of whom had ever spoken to each other before comparing notes years later, where a location with a specific history starts communicating through whatever electronic system happens to be present. The locks were just the beginning. 2 weeks after the "I don't like this house" incident, the speakers started playing music. Not through Spotify. Not through any account Daniel or Priya owned. At 3:33 a.m., and I want you to remember that number because it comes back, every speaker in the house would play simultaneously a single held note. Not a song. Not static. A note. Investigators who later pulled the Smart Hub's activity logs, and yes, this actually happened, there is a report, found no command in the system's history that corresponds to that audio output. As far as the software was concerned, nothing happened at 3:33 a.m. The speakers should have been silent. They were not. Now you might be thinking, okay, but couldn't this just be a hacked hub? Couldn't someone nearby be pranking them through a vulnerability? And that's a completely fair question. I asked it too when I first came across this case. Here's the answer. Daniel, being a software engineer, thought exactly that. He spent an entire weekend combing through logs, checking for unauthorized access, resetting every device, changing every password, even swapping out the hub for a brand new unit still in the box. The 3:33 a.m. tone happened again the very next night, on hardware that had never been connected to the internet before that afternoon. That's the part where Daniel stopped sleeping. This is where the story takes the turn that made me want to tell it to you in the first place, because up until now this could just be weird tech stuff happens, who knows. But stories like this always have a second half, and the second half is almost always about digging. Daniel started digging. Property records first, standard stuff, easy to pull. The house had changed hands 4 times in 11 years, each sale progressively cheaper than the last despite renovations that should have increased value. That's a red flag in real estate that most buyers never think to look for. A house that keeps losing value despite objective improvements is a house that people want to leave badly enough to eat the loss. Then he went further. Local newspaper archives. This took longer, and this is the part where I want you to lean in because this is where it stops being a smart home glitch story and becomes something else entirely. In 1994, the house belonged to a family named the Whitlocks. Husband, wife, 2 kids. And according to the archive police report, Daniel eventually got his hands on through a public records request. A report that took him nearly 2 months to obtain. The husband, a man named Roger Whitlock, was involved with a small religious group operating out of a property about 6 miles away. Not a registered church. Not anything with a denomination you'd recognize. The kind of group that gets described in old newspaper clippings with careful lawyer-approved language like a private spiritual community, because in 1994, nobody wanted to use the word cult in print without getting sued. Roger Whitlock started bringing group members to the house for what the surviving testimony, his wife's testimony, given to police the night everything happened, described only as sessions. She wouldn't elaborate further, not in the documents Daniel found, and honestly, I think that's the most unsettling detail in this entire case. Not what happened. The fact that a grown woman giving testimony to police in the aftermath of something clearly catastrophic chose her words that carefully. People don't do that unless they're protecting themselves from remembering too clearly. On the night of October 9th, 1994, something happened in that house that resulted in one of the group members, a 26-year-old woman whose name was redacted in every document Daniel could access, being found dead in what is now the living room. The exact room where, 27 years later, Daniel's smart hub sat quietly on a shelf. The official cause of death on the record: undetermined. Not homicide. Not suicide. Not accidental. Undetermined, which, if you've ever looked into how death certificates actually work, is a category that gets used astonishingly rarely, because it essentially means the medical examiner looked at the evidence and could not, in good conscience, check any of the other boxes. Roger Whitlock was questioned, never charged. The spiritual community dissolved within 6 months, and the house sat empty for nearly 2 years before it sold again at a steep discount to a family who lived there for 18 months before moving out. No explanation given in any public record Daniel could find. Now you might be thinking, and I want to answer this directly because it's the obvious pushback, Nick, this is just a house with a sad history. Sad things happen in houses all the time. That doesn't mean anything is haunting a smart speaker. And you're right to push back. I'd push back too. Except for one thing Daniel found buried in the original 1994 police report, in the responding officer's handwritten notes, not the typed summary, the kind of detail that never makes it into official records unless someone forgets to clean it up. The note said that when officers arrived at the house that night, every clock in the home, every single one including a wall clock, 2 alarm clocks, and the display on the family's microwave, was frozen at exactly 3:33. Here's where it gets really interesting, because up until this point you could argue coincidence. Old houses have old wiring, power surges happen, clocks reset to default times, whatever. Fine. I'll grant you that. I try to be fair in these videos. I don't want you walking away from this thinking I'm just feeding you spooky nonsense with no scrutiny behind it. But Daniel didn't stop at the newspaper archive. He reached out, cold email, no real expectation of a response, to the last known family who'd lived in the house before him, the ones who'd left after 18 months with, quote, no explanation given in public record. They responded. And what they told him, over a phone call that Daniel recorded with their permission, is the piece of this story that I genuinely think about more than almost anything else I've covered on this channel. The wife, I'll call her Ellen because that's not her real name and I promised her family I'd protect that, told Daniel that near the end of their time in the house, their infant daughter's baby monitor started doing something she never told anyone about. Not the police, not their families, not even most of their friends. She told Daniel because she said, you sounded like someone who'd actually understand, and I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask me the right question. The monitor would turn on its own, every night at 3:33 a.m. And through the static, because there was always static, a specific kind, a rhythmic kind, not random noise, they would hear what Ellen described as a woman counting. Not counting numbers you'd recognize. Counting in a cadence, over and over, that never got past a specific point before restarting. She said it sounded like someone counting steps. Or counting people in a room. Or, and this was Ellen's specific phrase, the one Daniel wrote down word for word because it disturbed him enough that he didn't trust himself to remember it accurately later. Counting how many of us were still there. They moved out 3 weeks after Ellen heard that phrase clearly enough to be sure it wasn't static shaping itself into words the way tired brains do at 3 a.m. They left most of their furniture behind. They told the real estate agent it was a job relocation. It wasn't. Now, I want to slow down here because this is the part of the story where most people, most viewers, if I'm being honest with you, expect the guy to pack up and leave immediately. That's the smart move. That's what I would tell you to do if you were asking me for advice instead of watching a story unfold. Daniel didn't leave. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that decision made sense because it didn't, not fully, not even to him. He told the friend who eventually helped him move out months later that some part of him needed to understand what was happening before he could let himself be afraid of it. That's a very engineer thing to think. That's a very, if I can just find the root cause, I can fix it mentality, and I think a lot of you watching this, especially if you work in tech, understand that impulse completely. You don't run from a bug. You debug it. So Daniel did something that, in hindsight, I think was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, and honestly, probably both. He set up a secondary recording system, completely separate from the smart home hub, battery-powered, no wireless connection to anything, an old-school digital camera on a tripod pointed at the living room, the exact spot where the 1994 report said the woman had been found. He wanted a control. Something the glitch, whatever it was, couldn't touch because it had no digital footprint to interfere with. For 9 nights, nothing unusual showed up on the independent camera, even while the smart speakers kept doing their 3:33 a.m. tone and the locks kept responding to phrases nobody programmed them to respond to. On the 10th night, Priya was staying at her sister's. She'd started doing that more and more by this point, and honestly that tells you something too, doesn't it? The person with no professional or personal investment in solving the mystery was the one who instinctively started distancing herself from the house. I think there's something in that. I think our instincts are often smarter than our reasoning, and we override them because we want to seem rational, and that override is exactly what gets people hurt in stories like this one. Daniel was alone in the house. And at 3:31 a.m., 2 minutes early, which he noted specifically because up until that point, everything had happened with an almost obsessive precision. At exactly 3:33, every light in the house turned on at once. He grabbed his phone. Not to call anyone, to check the smart home app, out of instinct, the same instinct that had gotten him this far. The app showed every device in the house as offline. Not malfunctioning. Not glitching. Offline, as if the entire system had been unplugged, even though every light in the house was blazing and every speaker, a moment later, began to hum that same held note, except this time it wasn't one note. It was 2. Now I need you to sit with that for a second because I didn't understand the significance of this detail the first time I heard this story either, and it took an actual audio engineer. Someone Daniel eventually consulted months after he'd left the house, once he was ready to actually analyze the recordings instead of just surviving them, to explain why 2 notes instead of 1 mattered so much. A single held tone, especially one repeating nightly at a fixed time, can plausibly be explained by a malfunctioning speaker, a corrupted audio file stuck in a playback loop, a hardware defect. Engineers see stuff like that all the time. It's eerie, but it's explainable. 2 notes, played in harmony from 2 separate speaker units in 2 separate rooms, synchronized down to the millisecond with no shared timing signal between them because the entire system was registering as offline. That's not a malfunction. That's not a bug replaying corrupted data. According to the audio engineer Daniel eventually hired to analyze the independent camera's audio track, which had picked up both tones clearly, the 2 notes formed a specific musical interval. Not a random interval. Not dissonance, which is what you'd expect from a glitch. Glitches sound like glitches, they sound wrong, unintentional. This sounded intentional. And here's the detail that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck the first time I read the transcript of Daniel's conversation with that engineer. The interval those 2 notes formed is the same interval that, in certain older liturgical and ritual musical traditions, was historically used to mark a call, meaning one voice signaling to another, waiting for a response. The house wasn't malfunctioning. The house was calling something, or answering it. Now you might be thinking, objection time, and I want to actually give this one real weight because it's the strongest pushback in this entire story. Nick, an audio engineer analyzing a scary anecdote months after the fact, working from an emotionally compromised client's description of events, is not exactly rigorous science. And I agree with you. I want to be honest with you about that. This isn't a peer-reviewed study. This is one man's account, corroborated partially by a previous resident who had every reason to want to be believed, and partially by an audio analysis performed after the fact, outside of a controlled environment. I'm not asking you to take this as courtroom-grade proof. I'm telling you this story because of what happened next, and because of how it ended, because that's the part that, personally, I have never been able to shake. After the two-note incident, Daniel didn't sleep in that house again. He stayed at a hotel for 4 nights while he arranged to move his and Priya's things out, quietly without telling the neighbors why, the same way every family before them apparently had. But on the last night before the movers came, Daniel went back alone. Not to sleep there. He told me, well, he told the person who eventually relayed this account to me because Daniel, understandably, doesn't do interviews about this anymore, that he needed to say goodbye to the house. Which sounds strange, I know. But if you've ever lived somewhere that changed you, even somewhere terrible, you understand that impulse a little. Closure is a real human need, even closure with a place that scared you. He stood in the living room, the spot from the 1994 report, the spot the camera had been trained on for 10 nights, at 3:30 in the morning on purpose this time, waiting. At 3:33 nothing happened. He almost laughed. He told his friend later that he almost laughed, standing there in an empty house at 3:33 a.m., feeling for the first time in weeks like maybe it really had just been a string of very unlucky coincidences stacked on top of an old, sad house with bad wiring and a tragic history that had nothing to do with him. And then from the kitchen. No speaker in the kitchen, none, they'd all been unplugged and boxed up 2 days earlier. He heard counting. Not static. Not a glitch. A woman's voice, counting, in that same halting cadence Ellen had described 20 years earlier from a device in a completely different room of the exact same house. Daniel told his friend he counted along in his head without meaning to, and he got to 7 before the voice stopped. 7. He left the house immediately. Didn't grab anything. Didn't look back. The movers came the next morning and finished the job without him there. Now, I promised you at the beginning of this video that I'd give you the full picture, and I want to be honest with you about what we actually know versus what we don't, because I think that honesty is what separates a story worth telling from just noise. We know the house has a documented history of an unexplained death in 1994. We know the cause of death was officially listed as undetermined, a rare classification. We know at least 2 separate families, 27 years apart, with no contact with each other, independently reported unexplained electronic activity at the exact same time, 3:33 a.m., including one family reporting the sound of counting through a baby monitor, and another reporting the same phenomenon through a completely different device with no possible technical connection. We know Daniel's professional background makes him an unusually credible witness. He wasn't looking for a haunting, he was actively trying to disprove one, using his actual professional skill set, and he failed to find a technical explanation despite months of trying. What we don't know, and I think this is important to say clearly, is what the number 7 means. What the counting means. Whether it's counting up towards something, or counting something that's already there, or counting the people who've lived in that house and left. Daniel has a theory, and it's not a comforting one, but I'll leave that for you to sit with rather than hand you a neat answer, because honestly, I don't think there is one. Not yet. The house on Meridian Lane sold again 8 months after Daniel and Priya moved out. Public records show the sale price was once again well under market value. I don't know who lives there now. I hope if they're watching this they got a camera pointed at that living room. And I hope for their sake that when 333 rolls around, they only ever hear one note. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin the way it's gotten under mine, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit that bell, and if it helped you feel a little less alone in thinking about this stuff at 2 in the morning, leave a like, because that's honestly the only reason I keep making these. I'm Nick. Keep your locks smart, keep your ears open, and I'll see you in the next one.